When my parents looked me in the eye and said they had transferred my entire inheritance to their new family, they expected me to scream. Instead, I just took a sip of water and whispered, "Interesting." They had no idea that their greed had just triggered a dormant safety protocol in a Swiss bank vault 3,000 miles away. They thought they were cutting me off, but they had actually just authorized their own financial ruin. My name is Emily Stevens. At 29 years of age, I am a senior financial risk analyst at a boutique firm in downtown Portland, Oregon. In my line of work, panic is a liability, and emotion is a variable that must be isolated and removed from the equation. My colleagues often joke that I have ice water in my veins. They tell me that when the market dips and the trading floor erupts into chaos, I look like I'm simply reading a dinner menu. They treat my composure as a superpower, a natural gift for detachment that makes me excellent at predicting when a stable structure is about to collapse. They are half right. It is a superpower, but it is not natural. It was a survival mechanism forged in the fires of a childhood where silence was the only currency I had to trade. To understand why I did not scream at the dinner table 20 years later, you have to understand the architecture of the house I grew up in. It was a beautiful house, sprawling and white, the kind of place that looked perfect on holiday cards. But inside, there were invisible lines drawn on the floor, borders that dictated who mattered and who was merely occupying space. My half-brother, Elliot, was the sun around which our domestic solar system revolved. I remember his 7th birthday party vividly. My father and my stepmother, Lydia, hired a petting zoo for the backyard. There were 3 ponies, a llama, and a professional photographer to capture every candid smile. They invited 40 children from his private school and catered a lunch that cost more than my first car would eventually cost. Elliot sat on a throne made of balloons, wearing a custom-tailored suit that matched my father's, basking in the adoration of a crowd that had been purchased for his amusement. My birthdays were different. They were quiet, almost apologetic affairs. I remember turning 10. It was a Tuesday. My father came home late from the office, looking harried, holding a plastic container from the local supermarket. It was a vanilla sheet cake with blue frosting, the kind that had been sitting in the display case for 2 days. They had forgotten to buy candles, so Lydia stuck a single match in the center and lit it. They sang the song quickly, their eyes darting to the clock, eager to get back to their real lives. I blew out the match, and the smoke drifted up into the silence. I did not complain. I ate my slice of dry cake and thanked them, because I had already learned the most important rule of the Stevens household. Be useful. Be silent. Do not take up space. The bias was not always as loud as a forgotten birthday. It lived in the microscopic details, the small gestures that cut deeper than any insult. I remember watching Lydia in the foyer one morning before school. Elliot was 12, and I was 16. Lydia stood in front of him, her hands gentle and attentive, brushing an invisible speck of lint from his blazer. She adjusted his collar, smoothed his hair, and looked at him with a gaze that was physically warm. I was standing right next to him. The strap of my backpack had snapped the day before, and I had safety pinned it back together. The metal pin was bright silver against the faded black canvas, jagged and obvious. Lydia looked at me, her eyes sweeping over the broken strap, and said nothing. She did not offer to fix it. She did not offer to buy a new one. She simply looked through the defect, and by extension, looked through me, to her. My brokenness was not a problem to be solved. It was just a natural state of being. That was when I began to develop the skills that would later make me a formidable analyst. I learned to read the room temperature before I walked in. I learned to predict my father's moods based on how he closed the front door. I became an expert at damage control, cleaning up messes before anyone had to acknowledge them. If Elliot broke a vase, I swept up the shards before Lydia came downstairs. If my father left sensitive documents on the kitchen counter, I moved them to his study before the cleaning staff arrived. I made myself indispensable by being the invisible glue that held their perfect image together. There was only one person who saw the cracks in the foundation, mainly because she was the one who had built the house. My grandmother, Agnes Stevens, was a woman made of iron and old lace. While the rest of the family treated me like a piece of furniture, Agnes treated me like a confidant. Her study was my sanctuary. It always smelled of dried lavender and old paper, a sharp, clean scent that cleared my head. The room was lined with mahogany cabinets, all locked, and her desk was often covered in envelopes with foreign stamps and postmarks from places I could only find on a map. Agnes had a way of looking at you that made you feel like she was reading your bone marrow. She would sit in her high-backed leather chair, sipping tea that was too bitter for anyone else, and lecture me on the nature of wealth. She told me once that Americans are obsessed with loud money. She said they like money they can see, money they can park in the driveway or wear on their wrists. But she told me that visible money is vulnerable money. She said that real protection, the kind that survives wars and calamities, lives in the shadows. It lives in the places people forget to look. I was 22 when she called me into her study for the last time. The cancer was already eating away at her, making her skin look like parchment, but her eyes were as bright and terrifying as ever. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small velvet pouch. She placed it in my hand and closed my fingers over it. It was heavy. I opened the pouch and slid the object out into my palm. It was a key, but not like any key I had ever seen. It was made of dull, heavy steel, longer than a standard house key, with complex ridges that looked more like the teeth of a saw. The head of the key was thick and round, and stamped into the metal was a strange crest. It looked like a mountain peak with a small crosshair superimposed over it. Agnes leaned forward, her voice a dry rasp. She told me to listen carefully. She said that this key was not for a door in this house. She said it was a failsafe. She told me that people are predictable, especially greedy people. She told me that one day, my father and his wife would show me exactly who they were. She said they would strip away the pretense and the politeness, and they would try to erase me. I remember trying to interrupt her. I told her she was being dramatic. I told her that Dad and Lydia were distant. Sure, but they were not villains in a movie. I was young and naive, and I still desperately wanted to believe that my family loved me in their own flawed way. Agnes just shook her head. She told me that when that day came, when they finally showed me their true nature, I would know what to do. She made me promise to keep the key safe. She made me promise never to show it to Daniel or Elliot. I promised, mostly to calm her down. I tucked the key back into the velvet pouch and slipped it into my pocket, thinking it was just the paranoia of a dying woman who had read too many spy novels. Agnes passed away 3 weeks later. Her death was the signal my father had been waiting for. The mourning period was short and efficient. Within 6 months, Daniel and Lydia began the renovations. They gutted Agnes's study first. They tore out the mahogany cabinets and the smell of lavender, replacing them with bright white shelving and modern art that looked like splashed paint. They erased her presence from the house just as they had slowly erased mine. I moved out shortly after. I went to college, paid my own way with student loans and 3 part-time jobs, and built a life in Portland. I became the daughter they loved to talk about at cocktail parties, but never actually called. They would tell their friends that Emily was so independent, so self-sufficient. They used my isolation as a badge of honor for their parenting. Look how well we raised her, they seemed to say. She needs nothing from us. And they were right. I needed nothing from them, or so I thought. For 7 years, that steel key sat in the bottom of a felt bag, tucked away in a shoebox at the back of my sock drawer. I moved 5 times, and each time, I almost threw it away. It seemed silly to keep a heavy piece of metal that opened nothing. It was a relic of a conversation that made no sense. But I never could bring myself to toss it in the trash. Every time I held it, I felt that strange weight, that cold density that felt less like a key and more like a weapon. I would run my thumb over the stamped crest, the mountain and the crosshair, and I would hear Agnes's voice in my head. When they show you who they are. I did not know it then, but Agnes was not being dramatic. She was being strategic. While I was analyzing market trends and predicting corporate collapses, she had analyzed the greatest risk of all, her own son. She had seen the greed growing in him like a tumor, nurtured by Lydia's insecurity and Elliot's entitlement. She knew that eventually, they would come for everything. So she built a trap door, and she gave the only key to the one person she knew they would never suspect, the one they thought was too quiet, too passive, too eager to please, the one they ignored. Tonight, as I sit in my apartment, staring at the rain streaking against the window, I finally understand. The key was not a keepsake, it was a trigger, and for the first time in my life, I am not looking to clean up the mess. I am waiting for the structure to fall. The drive to Lakeview Heights always felt like an ascent into a different atmospheric pressure. My father and Lydia had bought the house 3 years ago. Shortly after the renovation of the old family home had failed to satisfy their craving for reinvention. This new place was a sprawling architectural statement perched on a cliffside, all sharp angles and floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the city lights of Portland. It was a house designed to be photographed, not lived in. I parked my 10-year-old sedan between Elliot's gleaming SUV and my father's imported sports car. The contrast was so stark, it almost felt staged. A visual representation of the family hierarchy established long before I was born. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing down the lapel of my work blazer. My face was a mask of professional neutrality. I had spent the day analyzing liquidity crises for a mid-sized manufacturing firm, and I decided to treat this dinner with the same clinical detachment. Inside, the house smelled of beeswax and expensive lilies. The floors were Italian marble, cold enough to seep through the soles of my shoes. Everything was white or beige, or a shade of gray that existed only in high-end catalogs. It was beautiful, undeniably, but it felt hollow, like a stage set waiting for actors who never quite learned their lines. The dining room was dominated by a table that could have seated 20 people. Tonight, it was set for 5. Daniel, my father, sat at the head of the table. He looked older than the last time I had seen him, his hair thinning, his skin carrying the flushed tint of high blood pressure and expensive scotch. Lydia sat to his right, wearing a silk dress that was perhaps a bit too young for her, her neck draped in pearls that I recognized from Agnes's collection. She offered me a tight, brittle smile as I entered, the kind that did not reach her eyes. Opposite Lydia sat Elliot and his wife, Sienna. This was the centerpiece of the tableau. Sienna was holding their 6-month-old son, bouncing him gently on her knee. The baby was dressed in an outfit that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I watched them for a moment. They were using the child as a shield. It was a classic deflection tactic. Who could raise their voice or cause a scene in the presence of an innocent infant? The baby was not a guest. He was a prop for emotional blackmail. I took my seat at the far end of the table, a solid 8 feet away from my father. I was the afterthought, the footnote at the bottom of the page. Dinner was an elaborate affair of roasted quail and truffle risotto, served by a catering staff that moved like ghosts. The conversation was sparse and superficial. We talked about the weather. We talked about the traffic on the I-5. We talked about Elliot's golf game. No one asked about my job. No one asked about my life. They were filling the air with noise to drown out the sound of the guillotine they were hoisting above my head. The shift happened when the staff cleared the main course. My father cleared his throat, a sound that echoed slightly in the cavernous room. He placed his napkin on the table and folded his hands. It was a rehearsed gesture, one he used in boardrooms when he was about to deliver bad news to shareholders. "Emily," he began, his voice dropping an octave to simulate gravity. "We need to discuss some changes regarding the family estate, specifically, the assets your grandmother left behind." I cut a piece of the poached pear on my plate and looked up. "I'm listening." He exchanged a quick look with Lydia. She gave him a microscopic nod of encouragement. "You know that the market has been volatile," Daniel said, creating a problem that did not exist to justify a solution I did not ask for. And with Elliot starting his own family now, with the baby. He gestured vaguely toward the infant, who was now gnawing on a silver spoon. "We have been thinking about the future, about legacy, about protection." I put my fork down. Protection from what, exactly? From fragmentation, he said quickly. We decided that it is in the best interest of the family to consolidate the holdings, to keep everything under one roof, so to speak. It ensures stability for the new generation. He paused, waiting for me to interrupt. I did not. So, he continued, gaining speed, we have executed a restructuring of the trust, effective immediately. The controlling shares of Stevens Meridian Systems and the associated liquid assets from Agnes's estate have been transferred to a new family trust. The beneficiaries are Elliot, Sienna, and the baby. He stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized like the cabin of an airplane. Lydia jumped in, her voice high and breathless. It is what Agnes would have wanted. Emily, truly, if she could see how settled Elliot is now, how responsible he has become with the baby. She was always so big on family unity. You know that. She said this while looking at a spot on the wall 3 inches to the left of my head. She could not look me in the eye. And let us be honest, Daniel added, leaning back, his confidence returning now that the words were out. You have always been the independent one, Emily. You have your career. You have never needed our help. You are strong. We knew you would understand that Elliot needs this support more than you do. He has a family to provide for now. There it was. The punishment for competence. Because I had never asked them for money. Because I had built a life without their handouts. They decided I did not deserve the inheritance my grandmother had specifically earmarked for me. They were framing their theft as a compliment to my resilience. I looked around the table, switching my vision to the analytical mode I used when assessing a failing company. I looked at Sienna. Her thumb was manicured in a perfect shade of blush pink, but she was aggressively picking at the hem of the baby's cashmere blanket. Pick, 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 a nervous tick. She knew this was wrong. She knew they were stealing, and her anxiety was leaking out through her hands. I looked at Elliot. He was studying his wineglass with a look of practiced humility, the look of a man who had just won a lottery he rigged, but wanted to appear surprised. He did not look at me. He could not. He was weak, and weak men hate facing the people they betray. I looked at Lydia. Her hand was resting on the stem of her wineglass. The liquid inside was vibrating. It was a tiny, rhythmic ripple. Her hand was shaking. She was terrified of a confrontation. So, I said, my voice calm. To clarify, you have removed my name from the estate entirely. You have transferred ownership of the holding company that grandmother built to Elliot. It is a restructuring, Daniel insisted, frowning. Do not use such harsh language. We are simply securing the future for the family. The family, I repeated, which implies I am not part of it. Oh, Emily, stop, Lydia snapped, her anxiety flaring into defensiveness. Do not be dramatic. You will always be welcomed here. This is just business. It is just paper. Just paper. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated against my thigh under the table. It was a single, sharp buzz. I ignored it for a second, but then it buzzed again, a long, sustained vibration that meant a high-priority alert. I kept my eyes on my father, but I slid my hand into my lap and tilted the screen just enough to see the notification. It was not a text message. It was a security alert from an encrypted email server I had set up years ago and almost forgotten about. The subject line was read: Unauthorized access attempt, blocked, source, Alpenstein Private Bank, status, Protocol Edelweiss activated. My heart did not speed up. In fact, it slowed down. The room suddenly felt very sharp and clear. The timestamp on the alert was 2 minutes ago. They had not just decided this. They had tried to execute the transfer right now, or perhaps earlier this afternoon, timed to coincide with this dinner, so that by the time they told me, the money would already be gone. They wanted to present me with a fait accompli. But they had hit a wall they did not know existed. Agnes had been right. She had been right about everything. She had predicted this exact moment, this exact conversation, perhaps even this exact dinner menu. She had known that Daniel's greed and Lydia's insecurity would eventually cannibalize their morality. I realized then that the key in my apartment, the heavy steel thing with the strange mountain crest, was not just a sentimental token, it was the physical component of the digital alert flashing on my phone. Daniel was still talking. He was rambling now, filling the silence with empty reassurances. We can discuss a small stipend for you. Of course, for a transitional period, we do not want you to feel abandoned. A stipend from my own money. I reached for my water glass. The condensation was cold against my fingertips. I lifted it, held it for a moment, and then set it down on the marble table. I did not slam it, but I set it down with a deliberate, calculated force. Clack! The sound was sharp, like a pistol crack in the quiet room. Lydia jumped. Her wine sloshed over the rim of her glass, staining the white tablecloth red. Elliot looked up, startled. Even the baby stopped moving for a second. The room went dead silent. They were all looking at me, waiting for the scream, waiting for the tears, waiting for the explosion that would justify their decision to cut out the emotional, unstable daughter. I looked at Daniel. I looked at the sweat beading on his upper lip. I looked at the lie he was wearing like a suit. I picked up my napkin, dabbed the corner of my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate. Interesting, I said. My voice was not loud. It was flat. It was the voice I used when I told a CEO that his company was insolvent. It was devoid of anger, devoid of sadness, and absolutely terrifying to anyone who knew how to listen. Interesting? Daniel repeated, blinking. He looked confused. He had prepared for a fight, not for this chilly indifference. Yes, I said. Standing up, I picked up my clutch. Very interesting. I did not look back as I walked to the door. I could feel their eyes on my back, confused and unsettled. They thought my silence was acceptance. They thought they had won. They had no idea that by trying to erase me, they had just authorized a counterstrike that had been waiting in a Swiss server farm for 20 years. As I walked out into the cool night air of Portland, I checked my phone again. A second email had arrived. Awaiting confirmation from primary beneficiary. I smiled, unlocked my car, and started the engine. The dinner was over. The work was just beginning. The silence of my apartment building's underground parking garage was heavy, pressing against the windows of my sedan like deep water. I had been sitting here with the engine off for 20 minutes. The concrete walls were stained with oil and exhaust soot, a stark, gritty contrast to the polished marble and lilies I had just left behind at Lakeview Heights. I closed my eyes. In my mind, I was not sitting in a dark car. I was standing in front of a bank of monitors in my office. I replayed the dinner scene. I rewound the audio of my father's voice. I zoomed in on the twitch in Lydia's cheek. I tagged each moment with a metadata label: manipulation, greed, fear, deceit. I was not crying. I checked my pulse against the inside of my wrist. 72 beats per minute. Normal. The crushing weight in my chest was not sorrow. It was the pressure of data that had not yet been processed. I reached across to the passenger side and opened the glove compartment. It was cluttered with the mundane artifacts of a commuter's life: tire pressure gauges, old registration papers, a handful of napkins, but tucked in the very back, wedged behind the owner's manual, was the navy blue velvet box. I pulled it out. The velvet was worn at the corners, the fabric flattened by years of being ignored. I opened the lid. The key was exactly as I remembered it. Steel, cool to the touch, unnecessarily heavy. The ridges were sharp enough to scratch skin, but it was the head of the key that drew my focus now. Under the dim yellow light of the garage ceiling lamp, I traced the stamped crest with my thumb, a mountain peak, a crosshair. It was the same symbol that was currently glowing on my phone screen. I unlocked my phone and opened the email notification that had interrupted my father's speech. The sender was Alpenstein Private Bank. The name meant nothing to the general public, but in the world of high-stakes wealth management, banks like Alpenstein were ghosts. They did not advertise. They did not have branches you could walk into. They existed in the negative space between international jurisdictions. The subject line read, "Attempted transfer blocked per Stevens-Agnes protocol." I tapped the message open. The body of the text was sparse, written in precise, sterile English. "Dear Ms. Stevens, we are writing to inform you that a Level 3 security event has been triggered regarding Project Edelweiss at 1900 hours Eastern Standard Time. A request was received from a U.S.-based brokerage firm acting on behalf of Mr. Daniel Stevens to liquidate and transfer assets held within the master trust structure. Pursuant to the standing instructions of the grantor, Mrs. Agnes Stevens, this action has been interpreted as a hostile breach of the generational covenant. The transfer has been blocked, the assets have been frozen, the reversion protocol is now active. We require immediate identity verification from the primary beneficiary to proceed to the next phase." I stared at the words, Project Edelweiss. It sounded like a spy novel, something Agnes would have chuckled at, but the implications were terrifyingly real. My father had not just decided to cut me off tonight, he had already tried to move the money. He had sat there, carving into his roasted quail, knowing that hours earlier, he had instructed a broker to drain the accounts that Agnes had left behind. I scrolled down. Attached to the email was a high-resolution scan of a document. It was yellowed with age, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was a signature card, the kind used to open a bank account. And there, next to Agnes's sharp, angular script, was my own signature. It looked shaky, the handwriting of a child. I squinted at the date. I was 12 years old. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. I remembered a rainy afternoon in Agnes's study. She had told me we were playing a game. She said she was teaching me how to sign important papers, like a grown-up. She had made me sign 3 different cards, guiding my hand, telling me to be consistent. Then she had taken a picture of me, holding up a newspaper from that day. I had thought it was play. She was building a biometric profile. She had authenticated me with the bank nearly 2 decades ago. Below the scan was a business card, also digitized. Lucas Brenner, Senior Relationship Manager, Alpenstein Private Bank, Zurich. The logo on the card was the mountain and the crosshair. I continued reading the email. It contained a log of the failed attempts. Attempt 1, 14:30 hours. Transfer of $2 million requested. Status: denied. Attempt 2, 1500 hours. Transfer of remaining equity portfolio requested. Status: denied. Attempt 3, 1645 hours. Full liquidation of holding company assets requested. Status: denied. Security lockout initiated. My father had gotten desperate. I could see the panic in the timestamps. When the first small transfer failed, he tried a bigger one. When that failed, he tried to take everything. He had walked into that dinner knowing he was failing, hoping that by bullying me into submission, he could somehow force the lock to open. He did not understand that the lock was not on the door. The lock was the house itself. Agnes had built a financial structure that acted like a Chinese finger trap. The harder you pulled, the tighter it gripped. I felt a strange sensation in my throat. I waited for the sob, but it never came. Instead, a cold clarity washed over me. The part of my brain that analyzed risk for a living finally took the wheel. I exited the email app and opened a blank note on my phone. I typed the header, Case File, Stevens Family. I began to build a timeline. I logged the date and time of the dinner. I cross-referenced it with the timestamps from the bank's security log. I noted the IP address listed in the attempted transfer report. It traced back to the residential internet service at Lakeview Heights. Evidence of intent. I typed, premeditated asset stripping. I wrote down the names of the people present, Daniel, Lydia, Elliot, Sienna. I listed their potential motivations. Daniel. Insolvency? Lydia. Social climbing? Elliot. Debt? I was turning my life into a spreadsheet. It was the only way I knew how to process the magnitude of the betrayal. If I looked at it as a daughter, it would destroy me. If I looked at it as an analyst, it was just a problem set with a very specific solution. I looked at the key in my lap again. It was no longer a mysterious object. It was a physical two-factor authentication token. Agnes had known that digital passwords could be stolen, signatures could be forged, but a physical key held by the one person no one paid attention to? That was secure. I went back to the email from Alpenstein. I hit reply. My fingers hovered over the glass screen. This was the point of no return. Once I sent this, I was acknowledging that the war had started. I was admitting that my family was gone, replaced by adversaries in a legal dispute. I thought of the vanilla cake with the single match. I thought of the safety pin on my backpack. I thought of Elliot's smirk as he looked at his wine glass. I typed, To Lucas Brenner, Alpenstein Private Bank, from Emily Stevens. Subject, Attempted transfer, blocked per Stevens Agnes protocol. Mr. Brenner, I confirm receipt of your alert. I am Emily Stevens. The signature on file is mine. The key is in my possession. My family believes they have successfully removed me from the estate. I have no intention of correcting them yet. Please provide the next steps for full activation of the protocol. I am requesting a direct meeting. I can be in Zurich in 48 hours. Regards, Emily Stevens. I pressed send. The whoosh sound of the email departing was the only noise in the car. I put the phone down and picked up the key, closing my fist around it until the metal bit into my palm. For years, I had wondered if I was cut off from my family. I had wondered if I was unloved, unwanted, a mistake to be tolerated. But as I sat there in the dark garage, I realized the question had been wrong all along. The question wasn't whether I had been cut off. The question was, who was holding the knife? For 20 years, my father thought he held it. He thought he could carve up Agnes's legacy however he saw fit. He didn't realize that Agnes had designed the knife with a double edge, and tonight, when he tried to plunge it into my back, he had simply grabbed the blade. I started the car. The engine purred to life. I wasn't going back to my apartment to sleep. I had a flight to book, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for permission. The next morning, at exactly 8:45, I called my supervisor at Northline Metrics Studio. I kept my voice steady, pitching it just low enough to suggest exhaustion without inviting pity. I told him I had a family emergency. It was the first time in 4 years I had used that phrase. He did not ask for details. He knew my work ethic was ironclad, and he simply told me to take the time I needed. It was not a lie. Technically, there was an emergency. It just was not the kind that involved hospital waiting rooms or sudden grief. It was an emergency of corporate governance. I drove downtown, parking 3 blocks away from the address I had found in the navy blue velvet box. The office of Graham Voss was located in a pre-war building that smelled of floor wax and old money. There was no glass facade, no marble lobby, and no receptionist with a headset. There was just a heavy oak door with a small brass plaque that read Voss and Associates. I knocked once. "Come in, Ms. Stevens," a voice called out before I even touched the handle. Graham Voss looked exactly how Agnes had described him, a man who read the fine print for a living. He was sitting behind a desk that was completely bare except for a single manila folder. He was perhaps 60, wearing a suit that was expensive but aggressively unstylish. He did not smile when I entered. He simply gestured to the leather chair opposite him. "You are punctual," he said. "Agnes said you would be." "I assume you know why I am here," I said. Sitting down, I placed my handbag on the floor and folded my hands in my lap. Graham nodded. He reached for the folder on his desk. The label was typed in bold. Black ink. Stevens Safe, Edelweiss. "I have been billing the estate for a monthly retainer for 7 years, Graham said, his voice dry and precise. "My only instruction was to wait. Agnes paid for my silence and my patience. She told me that one day I would receive a specific digital handshake from Alpenstein Private Bank in Zurich. That notification arrived on my server last night at 7:18 in the evening." He opened the folder. It was thick with documents, flowcharts, trust deeds, and incorporation papers. "Agnes was a brilliant woman," Graham continued. She loved your father, but she did not trust him. She knew that Daniel had a weakness for what she called visible success. He likes things he can show off: big houses, flashy cars, trophy wives. I nodded. Lydia. Precisely. When Daniel married Lydia, Agnes realized that the family wealth was at risk of being consumed by their lifestyle. So, she executed a maneuver that is known in my trade as a bifurcated estate strategy. Graham turned the file around and slid a complex diagram toward me. Agnes left a significant portion of her assets in the United States, he explained, tracing a line on the paper with a silver pen. Real estate, cash accounts, domestic stocks, this is the money Daniel and Lydia see. It is the money they have been spending. It is the pot of gold they think they control. It is substantial enough to make them feel rich, which keeps them distracted. He tapped a box at the top of the chart. But the core capital, the intellectual property rights, the long-term bonds, and most importantly, the controlling equity blocks, was quietly moved offshore before she died. She transferred it all into a Swiss holding company called Edelweiss Holdings AG. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the structure. It was elegant. It was ruthless. Here's the part your father does not understand, Graham said, a hint of amusement creeping into his tone. Daniel believes he owns Stevens Meridian Systems. He is the CEO. He sits in the big office, but Stevens Meridian is a publicly traded company with a very specific ownership structure. The majority of the voting shares, 51%, are not held by Daniel. They are held by the family trust. And the family trust, I said, connecting the dots, is owned by Edelweiss Holdings. Correct, Graham said, and up until last night, the voting rights of Edelweiss were dormant, automatically proxied to the sitting CEO of the American branch. That was the status quo. As long as Daniel behaved, he got to play king. Graham flipped a page. The header read, Trigger Events, Level 3. However, Graham said, his voice hardening, the Edelweiss bylaws contain strict covenants. The moment any attempt is made to alienate a lineal descendant from the beneficial interest, that is you, Emily, the proxy is revoked, immediately, automatically. He looked me dead in the eye. When Daniel tried to transfer your inheritance to Elliot last night, he did not just fail to move the money, he accidentally fired himself. I sat back, the air leaving my lungs in a slow, controlled exhale. My father had walked into that dinner thinking he was the emperor of his domain. He had looked down his nose at me, thinking he held all the cards. He had no idea that his entire authority was derived from a Swiss shell company that had just flagged him as a hostile actor. So, I said, my voice steady, who controls Edelweiss now? Graham pushed a document toward me. It was a power of attorney, drafted years ago, waiting for a signature. You do, he said, or rather, you will. Once you complete the authentication process in Zurich, you are the standby controller. Upon activation of a Level 3 event, all voting rights, all dividend distributions, and all executive oversight of Stevens Meridian Systems revert to you. I looked at the paperwork. This was not just about money. This was about dominion. If I signed this, I would effectively become my father's boss. I could audit him. I could veto his decisions. I could, if the evidence warranted it, fire him from the company his mother built. I did not feel giddy. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the cold, sharp focus of an analyst looking at a broken system that needed to be fixed. What is the liability? I asked. If I assume control, do I inherit his debts? Is Edelweiss insulated from any lawsuits pending against the American entity? Graham raised an eyebrow. He looked impressed. Excellent questions. Edelweiss is ring-fenced. It is a separate legal entity. You are protected from Daniel's personal liabilities. However, as the majority shareholder, you will have a fiduciary duty to stop the bleeding if the American company is being mismanaged. It is being mismanaged, I said. I have seen the public filings. He is over-leveraged. Then you will have work to do, Graham said. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope. The return address was printed in embossed silver ink. Alpenstein Private Bank, Zurich. This arrived via courier this morning, Graham said. It is your formal invitation. Lucas Brenner is expecting you. I took the envelope. It felt substantial, like a diploma or a death warrant. What do I tell them? I asked. My father, Elliot, Lydia. Graham leaned back in his chair and tented his fingers. That is the beauty of the Stevens-Agnes protocol. You tell them absolutely nothing. He smiled for the first time, a thin, shark-like expression. The bank has frozen the assets, but they have not notified Daniel of the reason. His broker will just be seeing processing errors or compliance holds on his screen. Daniel will think it is a bureaucratic glitch. He will think he can fix it with a few angry phone calls. He does not know the ownership has shifted. So we let him flail, I said. We let him continue, Graham corrected. Let him spend money he thinks is coming. Let him make promises to Elliot that he cannot keep. Let Lydia plan her renovations. The more they act on the assumption that the transfer was successful, the more evidence we generate of their intent to defraud the estate. We build the case file, I said, tapping the folder. Exactly, Graham said. Go to Zurich, meet with Brenner, secure the keys to the kingdom. In the meantime, I will handle the paperwork on this end. By the time you come back, we will not just be able to stop them, we will be able to dismantle them. I stood up. I smoothed my skirt. I felt different than I had when I walked in. I was no longer just the ignored daughter or the quiet analyst. I was the incoming administration. Thank you, Graham, I said. Don't thank me, he replied, opening the file again. Thank Agnes. She knew exactly how this game would be played. She just needed a player who knew how to keep a poker face. I walked out of the office and into the bright, gray light of the Portland morning. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Elliot. Mom says you were rude last night. We are just doing what is best for the family. You need to grow up and accept reality. I looked at the message. I looked at the cream-colored envelope in my hand. I did not reply. I simply deleted the text. Elliot was right about one thing. I did need to accept reality. And the reality was, I was about to own the very ground they were standing on. I walked to my car, opened the door, and tossed the envelope onto the passenger seat next to the velvet box. Next stop, I said to the empty car, Switzerland. As I packed my suitcase for Zurich, folding my blazers with the same military precision I applied to my spreadsheets, the ghost of my grandmother shifted in the room, for years. My memories of Agnes had been soft, sepia-toned fragments of comfort, the smell of lavender, the taste of peppermint tea, the feeling of her hand on my shoulder. But as I placed the navy blue velvet box into my carry-on, those memories sharpened. They stopped being nostalgia and started looking like what they actually were, a set of instructions that I had been too young to read. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my passport, and suddenly I was back in the hallway of the old house, 15 years ago. I realized now that Agnes had not been blind to what was happening, while I was learning to make myself invisible to survive. She had been watching the predators. She observed the way Daniel and Lydia spent money like it was a renewable resource. She saw the kitchen renovations that cost $40,000, the imported Italian marble, the way they leased cars they could not afford to buy. But more importantly, she watched how they budgeted for me. To them, I was not a daughter. I was a line item in a spreadsheet that they desperately wanted to delete. I was a recurring cost to be minimized. I remembered the year Agnes went to Europe for 3 months. She told the family she was going to a wellness clinic in the Swiss Alps to treat her arthritis. Daniel had rolled his eyes and complained about the expense, but he was secretly glad to have the old matriarch out of the house so he could host his loud dinner parties. But Agnes was not getting massages. She was building a fortress. That was when she met Lucas. She had not gone to a clinic. She had gone to Alpenstein. She had sat in a quiet room with a view of the lake and told a banker that she needed to create a paradox, a trust that looked accessible but was actually a vault. I recalled a conversation I had overheard between Agnes and my father when she returned. It was a test. I knew that now. They were in the sunroom. Agnes was sipping her tea. looking frail and harmless. "I have been thinking, Daniel," she had said, her voice wavering perfectly. "Perhaps I should move some of the European accounts back to the States. It is so complicated keeping track of things in Zurich. Maybe it would be simpler if you helped me manage it." I was sitting on the floor in the next room, doing my homework. I heard the sudden silence. I heard the sound of a chair scraping against the floor as my father leaned in. "That sounds like a wise idea, Mother," he had said. His voice was dripping with a hunger so raw I could smell it through the wall. "Lydia and I could certainly take that burden off your shoulders. We could merge it with the family portfolio, for efficiency." Agnes had not moved the money. She had just wanted to see if his teeth would come out. They did. That night, she called me into her study. She did not talk about Daniel. Instead, she put a stack of papers in front of me. I was 12. "Emily," she said, "I need you to help me sort these. Put the ones that say beneficial owner in the blue pile, and the ones that say trustee in the red pile." I thought I was being a helpful granddaughter. I thought we were playing office. I did not realize she was conducting a subliminal orientation. She made me read the words aloud. Controlling interest, irrevocable, fiduciary duty. She was planting the vocabulary of my own salvation into my brain before I even knew I needed saving. But the most chilling memory, the one that made my hands pause over my suitcase, was the night of the mirror. It was a memory I had suppressed because it was too painful, but now it surfaced with clarity. I was 16. Agnes was still alive, but slowing down. I had come downstairs late at night to get a glass of water. The door to the master bedroom was slightly ajar. My father was inside. He was not sleeping. He was standing in front of the full-length mirror, adjusting his tie, holding a glass of scotch. He was talking to himself, rehearsing. Agnes was standing in the shadows of the hallway, leaning on her cane. She was watching him. She saw me, and she put a finger to her lips, signaling me to be quiet. We stood there, two ghosts in the dark, listening to the man we both loved and feared. "It is just practical," Daniel was saying to his reflection, practicing his tone. "Agnes is old. She does not understand modern finance. We move the core assets to the new trust for Elliot. It is safer. Emily, well, Emily is resilient. She can take care of herself. It is better for the family legacy if the capital is concentrated. We just have to phrase it right." He took a sip of scotch and smiled at himself. "She does not need it. She is not really one of us, is she?" I felt Agnes stiffen beside me. I expected her to storm in there and hit him with her cane. I expected her to scream. But she did nothing. She simply turned around and walked silently back to her room. I followed her. I wanted to ask her if it was true, if I was not really one of them, but when I entered her room, she was already at her desk. She was not crying. She was writing. She was writing furiously in a leather-bound notebook. Now, looking at the email from Alpenstein again, I realized what she had been writing. She was drafting the Level 3 clause. Up until that night, I suspected Agnes had planned to be fair. She had planned to split the money. She loved Daniel, despite his flaws. But that night, watching her son practice how to rob her granddaughter while looking in a mirror, something in Agnes had snapped. She realized that fairness was not enough. She needed a weapon. She realized that Daniel did not just want the money. He wanted to rewrite the narrative of the family so that I did not exist in it. So she rewrote it first. She created the appendices. Graham had mentioned them, but now I remembered seeing her compile them. The little black book of grudges. I remembered coming home from school one day with a straight-A report card. Lydia had barely glanced at it before tossing it on the counter to complain that Elliot's tennis tutor was 5 minutes late. Agnes had been there. She had picked up the report card, praised me, and then I saw her take out that notebook. She wrote down the date. She wrote down the incident. I remembered when I was accepted into the state science fair finals. My father forgot to drive me because he was busy looking at boat catalogs with Elliot. I missed the competition. Agnes had driven me for ice cream instead. And then, when we got home, she went straight to her desk. I had thought she was just keeping a diary. I did not know she was building a legal case for emotional negligence. She was documenting the pattern. She was proving to a Swiss court, years in advance, that I was the disenfranchised beneficiary. She knew that one day, Daniel and Lydia would try to sell a story about how much they loved me, how they were only protecting me, and she wanted to make sure that from the grave, she could pull out a notebook and say, "Liar." The final memory that clicked into place was the day she gave me the key. I had replayed that scene 1,000 times, focusing on the weight of the metal and the strangeness of the symbol, but I had forgotten the texture of her voice. She had held my hand, her skin like dry paper over fragile bones. "Emily," she had whispered, "you are going to be very angry one day. When you find out what they have done, you will want to burn the house down." She squeezed my hand. "This key is not for burning," she said. "Fire is messy. Fire destroys everything. This key is for building." She looked at me with an intensity that frightened me. "They think power is noise. They think power is a big party and a loud speech. I want you to show them that power is gravity. It is invisible. It is silent. And it holds everything in place whether they like it or not." "Why me, Grandma?" I had asked. "Why not just leave it to me in the will?" "Because a will is a request," she said. "And your father has never been good at listening to requests. I need to give you a command, but I can only give it to you when you are ready to give it to yourself." "I don't understand," I said. "You will," she said. "This is not to pay them back for being cruel. This is to ensure that the person they tried to make invisible is the only one they can never erase." I zipped up my suitcase. The sound was sharp in the quiet apartment. Agnes had not wanted me to strike first. She knew that if I had inherited the money at 21, Daniel would have manipulated me out of it. He would have guilted me, bullied me, or tricked me. I was too soft then. I still wanted their love. She had to wait until they broke me. She had to wait until they cut the cord themselves. She had to wait until I was sitting at that marble table, watching them toast to my erasure, before I was cold enough to use the weapon she had forged. She did not leave the money to her granddaughter. She left it to the woman she knew I would become. I walked to the window and looked out at the Portland skyline. Somewhere out there, Daniel was probably telling his broker to try the transfer again. Lydia was probably picking out new curtains for a house she no longer owned. Elliot was probably sleeping soundly, dreaming of a future that had already been foreclosed. "Okay, Agnes," I whispered to the glass. "I am listening now." I picked up my bag. I had a plane to catch, and for the first time in 20 years, I did not feel like the girl who was waiting for someone to remember her birthday. I felt like gravity. While I was sitting in the quiet calm of the Delta Sky Club, sipping sparkling water and reviewing the bylaws of Edelweiss Holdings AG, my family was busy performing a victory lap on a track that had already been demolished. Thanks to the wonders of modern technology and a few burner accounts I kept for due diligence, I could watch their celebration in real time. Lydia was particularly active on social media. She had posted a photo of a sunrise over Lakeview Heights with a caption that read, "New beginnings. Grateful for clarity and the legacy we are building for the next generation." She had tagged it with phrases like generational wealth and family first. It was a masterclass in public relations for a life that was currently being foreclosed upon. She had no idea that the legacy she was bragging about was currently sitting in my carry-on bag, wrapped in blue velvet. But the main event of the evening was happening at the Summit, one of Portland's most pretentious rooftop restaurants. It was the kind of place where a salad cost $30 and the view was the primary ingredient. Elliot and Sienna had booked the best table to celebrate their financial security. They had invited 2 other couples, friends from the country club set, who they were desperate to impress. I knew this because Sienna had posted a story 3 hours ago. "Toast to the future," she had written, clinking a glass of vintage champagne against Elliot's tumbler. I put my phone down and checked the time. It was 9:30 in the evening in Portland. The check would be arriving right about now. I imagined the scene. The waiter, dressed in crisp black, placing the leather folder on the table. Elliot, flushed with wine and the arrogance of a man who thinks he has just inherited an empire. Reaching for his wallet, he would pull out the platinum card, the one attached to the joint account that Daniel replenished monthly. He would lay it down with a casual flick of the wrist, barely looking at the total. According to the logs Graham had shared with me, the freeze on the American accounts had propagated through the banking system at exactly 9:15. At the summit, the waiter would have returned to the table a few minutes later. He would have leaned down, keeping his voice low to avoid embarrassing the guests. He would have whispered that there was a problem with the chip, a technical glitch, perhaps. Could Mr. Stevens provide another form of payment? Elliot would have laughed. He would have made a joke about technology. He would have handed over the backup card, the gold reserve. I could see Sienna smiling tight-lipped at her friends, assuring them it was just a bank error. She would have taken a sip of water, her fingers tightening around the stem of the glass. The waiter would have walked away, and then he would have come back. This time, he would not be whispering. When a bill is over $2,000 and 2 cards are declined, the hospitality evaporates. The manager would have stepped in. I pictured him standing by the table, holding the declined cards like evidence. "I am sorry, sir," the manager would say, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Both cards have been flagged by the issuer. Do you have a personal card?" Elliot's face would have drained of color. He would have fumbled for his own debit card, the one linked to his personal checking account, which usually hovered near zero because he spent everything on leases and clothes. That one would have been declined too, not because of the freeze, but because Elliot was broke. The silence at the table would have been deafening. The friends, the ones they were trying to impress, would have started checking their phones, suddenly finding the floor very interesting. Sienna would have looked at Elliot with a mixture of panic and fury. The baby, sensing the tension, probably started to cry. And then, the inevitable climax. Someone at the next table, sensing the drama, would have subtly angled their phone. The video would not go viral immediately, but in their social circle, it would travel faster than light. The manager would have pulled Elliot aside, showing him the point-of-sale screen. Code 40. Restricted card. Contact financial institution. Elliot would have had to do the one thing that destroys a narcissist more than anything else. He would have had to walk back to the table, shoulders slumped, and ask his friend, let's call him Brad, to cover the bill. "I will Venmo you," Elliot would have muttered, his voice cracking. "My bank is just changing security protocols. It is a mess." Brad would have paid, of course, but the look in his eyes would have been pity, and that pity was the first shovel of dirt on Elliot's social grave. While Elliot was suffering through his public execution, Daniel was facing a more private, but equally devastating, lockout. My phone pinged with an automated alert from the Stevens Meridian internal server. As the standby controller, I had access to the system logs. Daniel was in his home office. The timestamp showed he was logged into the corporate treasury portal. He was attempting to approve a wire transfer of $50,000 to a consulting firm called Vantage Solutions. I knew Vantage. It was a shell company he used to siphon cash for personal expenses, consulting fees that paid for Lydia's jewelry and his golf trips. Usually, he just clicked approve, and the CFO rubber-stamped it the next morning. Tonight, however, when he clicked approve, the screen did not turn green, it turned red. I could picture him staring at the monitor, his glasses sliding down his nose. The error message would not say insufficient funds. It would say something much more confusing. Authorization revoked. Reason: objection by majority shareholder. Entity: Edelweiss Holdings AG. Daniel would be staring at the screen, blinking. In his mind, he was the proxy for the majority shareholder. He thought he controlled Edelweiss. He had no idea that the proxy had dissolved the moment he tried to steal my inheritance. He was probably clicking the mouse furiously, shaking the monitor, shouting for Lydia. But Lydia had her own problems. Graham had told me that part of the Level 3 response involved a full asset audit. Agnes had structured the loans on the Lakeview Heights house through a subsidiary of the Swiss holding company. It was a brilliant trap. Daniel and Lydia thought they had a mortgage with a local bank, but the paper was held by Edelweiss. Lydia would have been in the living room, perhaps looking at carpet samples, when the email arrived, or maybe it was a courier. The notification would be formal. It would state that due to material changes in the borrower's risk profile, the lender was exercising its right to reappraise the collateral. It would mention that the house was now subject to an immediate lien pending an investigation into misappropriation of trust assets. Lydia, who treated that house like her skin, would be reading the words lien and investigation and realizing that the walls she had just painted perfectly white were closing in on her. By the time I boarded my flight, the rumors had already started. Portland is a small city for the wealthy. The waiter at the summit would have told the bartender. The bartender would have told a customer. Brad would have told his wife on the drive home. Did you hear about the Stevens boy? Cards declined. All of them. I heard Daniel's accounts are frozen. Is it the IRS? No. I heard it is something international. Money laundering? I always knew they were living beyond their means. The text messages started arriving as the plane taxied to the runway. My phone lit up like a slot machine. First came Elliot. What did you do? My cards are not working. We are at dinner and I look like an idiot. Fix this immediately. Then Lydia. Emily, your father is having chest pains. The bank says there is a hold from the trust. Tell us the password. This is not funny. Then Daniel. He did not text. He called. Once, twice, 5 times. He left a voicemail. I did not listen to it, but the transcription preview read, "Ungrateful. Mistake. Ruin us all." They were not asking if I was okay. They were not asking why I had left the dinner. They were instantly, reflexively blaming me for the consequences of their own actions. They accused me of sabotage. They accused me of hurting the baby. They weaponized that child in every other sentence, as if my refusal to be robbed was a direct assault on an infant. I watched the messages roll in, analyzing them like data packets. This was the extinction burst. This was the moment the parasite realizes the host has detached, and it thrashes in panic. Then, a single email pushed through the noise. It was from Lucas Brenner. Subject: System status. Dear Miss Stevens, initial automated responses are active. Domestic assets are secured. The counterparties are reacting as predicted. Do not engage. Do not negotiate. The silence is doing the work for you. Safe travels. L. I smiled. It was the only honest communication I had received all night. The flight attendant walked by, checking seatbelts. Ma'am, please switch your device to airplane mode. Of course, I said. But before I cut the connection, I did one last thing. I opened the camera app. I placed the navy blue velvet box on the tray table. I opened it, revealing the heavy steel key with the mountain crest. Next to it, I placed my boarding pass, the destination ZRH clearly visible in bold letters. I snapped a picture. I did not post it on Instagram. I did not send it to the family group chat. I saved it to a private folder named Justice. It was not a taunt. It was a timestamp. It marked the exact minute I stopped being a victim and started being the CEO of their reckoning. I switched my phone to airplane mode. The signal bars vanished. The angry texts from Elliot, the threats from Daniel, the guilt trips from Lydia, they all disappeared into the ether. The plane accelerated down the runway. I felt the G-force push me back into my seat as we lifted off, leaving the lights of Portland and the chaos of the Stevens family below. I closed my eyes, and finally, for the first time in 20 years, I slept without dreaming of a house I didn't belong in. Zurich greeted me with a cold, gray precision that felt like a spiritual cleansing after the messy humidity of my family's drama. The jet lag was a dull throb behind my eyes, but my mind was operating with a crystalline sharpness. Portland was soft, all rain and coffee shops and passive-aggressive politeness. Zurich was hard. It was a city of stone facades that hid skeletons of steel and glass, a place where order was not just a preference but a religion. I took a taxi to the address on the business card. There were no flashing neon signs, no grand marble columns announcing the presence of vast wealth. Alpenstein Private Bank was located in a nondescript building on a quiet side street near the Bahnhofstrasse. The entrance was marked only by a small, polished brass plaque and a heavy timber door. The security guard inside did not look like a guard. He looked like a concierge at a five-star hotel, wearing a suit that cost more than my car. He checked my passport against a list on a tablet, nodded once, and gestured toward a frosted glass door that slid open silently as I approached. Inside, the bank was a study in intimidating minimalism. The floors were black slate, the walls were glass. The air was perfectly conditioned and completely silent. It felt less like a financial institution and more like a cathedral dedicated to the worship of privacy. A man was waiting for me in the lobby. He was tall, perhaps in his early 40s, with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing exactly where all the bodies are buried. He wore rimless glasses and a watch that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. "Ms. Stevens," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, cool, and dry. "I am Lucas Brenner, your grandmother." She was very precise in her descriptions. "I hope that is a compliment," I said. "In my line of work, accuracy is the only virtue," he replied. "Please, follow me." He led me down a corridor lined with modern art that looked like mathematical equations painted on canvas. We entered a conference room that overlooked a small, manicured courtyard. The table was made of a single slab of gray stone. There were no windows facing the street. We sat down. Lucas placed a slim tablet on the table but did not turn it on. Instead, he looked at my handbag. "You brought the token?" he asked. I reached into my bag and pulled out the velvet box. I took out the heavy steel key. Lucas nodded. He reached under the edge of the stone table. I heard a soft click, and a panel in the surface of the table slid open. It revealed a complex keyhole, completely flush with the mechanism. "Agnes insisted on this," Lucas said, a faint smile touching his lips. "She said digital codes can be hacked, but a physical key requires presence. Please." I inserted the key. It fit perfectly, the ridges meshing with the internal tumblers with a satisfying thunk. I turned it. A drawer slid out from the side of the table. Inside, there was no money, no diamonds, just two thick cream-colored envelopes and a black flash drive. Lucas retrieved them and placed them in front of me. "Phase 1, he said. I opened the first envelope. It contained a letter written in Agnes's hand. The ink was slightly faded, dated 8 years ago. "My dearest Emily, if you are reading this in Zurich, it means I am dead, and your father has finally disappointed me in the way I always feared he would. I chose Switzerland not for the scenery, but for the law, in America. Families are messy. Judges can be swayed by tears and stories about fairness. Here, a contract is a contract. The Swiss do not care about family dinners. They care about signatures. I have established a covenant within the Edelweiss Trust. It is a bad actor clause. I knew Daniel would eventually try to rewrite my will. He has always believed that he is the main character of this story, but he forgets that I am the author. The clause is simple. If any direct descendant attempts to disinherit another lawful beneficiary, the aggressor forfeits their own position. Control does not go to the next eldest. It goes to the one who was targeted." I looked up at Lucas. "The one who was targeted?" "Agnes defined it using specific metrics," Lucas said, his voice devoid of judgment. "We have been tracking them for years. Student debt load versus family assistance, income disparity, documented exclusion from family board meetings. By every quantifiable measure, you are the disenfranchised beneficiary as defined by the trust deed." He tapped the tablet, and a holographic schematic appeared in the air above the table. It showed a web of companies. "This is the reality," Lucas explained. "Daniel thinks he owns Stevens Meridian Systems. In truth, he owns a minority stake, Edelweiss Holdings AG, through 2 intermediary shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Singapore, controls 62% of the voting stock." He swiped his finger. The lines on the chart turned from blue to red. "When the Level 3 alert was triggered last night, The voting rights attached to that 62% were automatically transferred from the family proxy, your father, to you. I stared at the chart. 62%. I didn't just have a seat at the table. I owned the table. I owned the room. I owned the building. He has been working for me this whole time, I whispered. Technically, he has been working for Agnes, Lucas corrected. Now, he works for you. I opened the second envelope. This one was thinner. It contained a single sheet of paper with Agnes's handwriting. But it wasn't a letter. It was a list of predictions. 1. Daniel will claim reorganization to hide the theft. 2. Lydia will try to justify it using the new grandchild. 3. They will do it over a meal, likely a dinner, to minimize your reaction. 4. They will tell you it is for your own good. 5. They will believe you will forgive them. A chill ran down my spine. It was precise. It was exactly what had happened. Beat for beat. Line for line. She knew, I said. She knew them better than they knew themselves. She was a very observant woman, Lucas said. He picked up the black flash drive. And she was thorough. This contains the audio files. Audio files? Agnes recorded conversations, Lucas said simply. In the house? In the car. Whenever Daniel discussed the estate, we have recordings of him plotting to move assets before you found out. We have Lydia suggesting they cut your tuition support to pay for a vacation. All of it is time-stamped and archived here. He slid the drive toward me. This is not just gossip, Ms. Stevens, in a Swiss court, and indeed in a U.S. federal court regarding trust fraud. This is admissible evidence of conspiracy to defraud a beneficiary. I touched the cold plastic of the drive. It contained the voices of my family, plotting my erasure. It was a weapon of mass destruction. If I released this, I wouldn't just bankrupt them, I would humiliate them. I would destroy their social standing, their careers, their friendships. Lucas leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. The light from the glass walls reflected off his glasses, hiding his eyes. So, he said, his voice soft but heavy, we arrive at the question of execution. The system has paused the transfer. The assets are frozen, but the next step requires a human decision. He looked at me. Do you want to destroy them, Ms. Stevens? We can release the evidence to the SEC. We can file criminal charges for fraud. We can evict them from the Lakeview house by the end of the month. He paused. Or, he said, do you want to control them? The room was silent. Outside, a tram glided silently by on the street. Destroying them is quick, Lucas noted. It is satisfying, but it is messy. Controlling them, that is a longer game. It requires patience. It requires you to be colder. I looked at the key. I looked at the letters. I thought of Agnes, sitting in her study, smelling of lavender and planning this moment for a decade. She hadn't wanted a fire. She had said it herself. This key is not for burning. Agnes didn't want me to just blow up the house. She wanted me to become the landlord. I don't want to go to court, I said slowly. I don't want the headlines. I don't want people to look at me with pity. Then we choose the second option, Lucas said. He didn't smile, but his posture relaxed slightly. We tighten the leash. I want them to know, I said, my voice gaining strength. I don't want to sue them. I want them to sign it away. I want them to sit in a room and sign a document that acknowledges they lost. I want them to give it to me. Lucas nodded. A negotiated surrender, much more elegant, and much more painful for the ego. He tapped his tablet again. We will prepare the paperwork. We will frame it as a restructuring to save the company from the regulatory errors caused by their attempted transfer. We will offer them a lifeboat, but you will be the captain. I picked up the flash drive and dropped it into my purse. It clinked against the steel key. When can we start? I asked. Lucas stood up and walked to the glass wall, looking out at the gray, orderly city of Zurich. The freeze is already hurting them, he said. Let them bleed for another 24 hours. Let the panic set in. Then we will make the call. He turned back to me. Welcome to the board, Ms. Stevens. The air coming off the Limmat River was sharp enough to cut glass. It was my last night in Zurich, and the city was asleep, bathed in the amber glow of streetlights that reflected off the black water. I walked along the quay, the collar of my coat turned up against the wind, with Lucas Brenner's question echoing in my mind like a church bell. Do you want to destroy them, or do you want to control them? It was a seductive question. Part of me, the part that was still 11 years old and standing in a kitchen with a broken backpack, wanted to burn it all down. I wanted to see my father's name dragged through the mud on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. I wanted Lydia to be escorted out of the Lakeview Heights house by marshals while the neighbors watched. I wanted Elliot to have to actually work for a living. But as I walked past the shuttered storefronts of the Bahnhofstrasse, I realized that destruction was messy. Explosion creates shrapnel, and shrapnel has a way of hitting innocent bystanders. If I destroyed Stevens' Meridian systems, I would be putting 200 employees out of work. I would be tanking the stock price, which would devalue the very legacy Agnes had tried to protect. And more than that, destruction was emotional. It was a reaction. I did not want to react anymore. I wanted to architect a new reality. I returned to my hotel room and sat at the small desk. I opened the second folder Agnes had left for me, the one I had barely glanced at in the bank vault. Tucked behind the legal documents was a draft for a project she had titled the Agnes Stevens Resilience Fund. I read her handwriting, which was shaky but determined. For the ones who are told they are not enough, she had written, for the children who are treated like overhead costs, this fund is to provide legal aid, tuition assistance, and emergency housing for young adults who have been financially abused or disinherited by their families. I sat back in the chair. Agnes did not just want to save me. She wanted to build a life raft for every other Emily out there. She wanted to turn the Stevens fortune into a shield for the vulnerable. If I destroyed the company out of spite, this fund would never exist. That was the deciding factor. My response would not be a crime of passion. It would be a surgical restructuring. I would dismantle my parents' ability to harm me, not with a sledgehammer, but with a scalpel, and in the process, I would build something they could never touch. I picked up my phone and called Lucas. It was late, but I knew he would answer. We go with option 2, I said when he picked up, but with a modification. I am listening, Lucas said. I want a 2-phase deployment, I told him, my voice steady. Phase 1 is containment. We confirm my status as the controller. We activate the independent audit of Stevens' Meridian systems to freeze all non-essential spending. We prepare a summary file for the regulatory bodies in the United States to justify the hostile takeover of the board. And the press? Lucas asked. Usually, a leak to the financial press applies useful pressure. No press, I said firmly. Absolute silence. If this gets out, the stock drops. I need the company valuation to remain stable to fund the Resilience Fund. We do not give them the dignity of a public scandal. We keep this in the boardroom. I want them to feel suffocated by the quiet. Understood, Lucas said. And phase 2? Phase 2 is the transfer of power, I said. I will handle that in person. After I hung up, I called Graham Voss in Portland. It was early afternoon there. Graham, I said, I need you to set the stage. I have the paperwork ready, Graham replied. How do you want to play it? Send a notice to the board of directors, I instructed. Call for an emergency shareholder meeting this Thursday at noon. Location, the main conference room at Stevens Meridian. Daniel will try to block it, Graham warned. He will say he is the proxy holder. Let him try, I said. Frame the invitation as a compliance review regarding the frozen accounts. Make it sound bureaucratic. Make it sound like a technicality we need to clear up so he can get his money. If he thinks he is coming to sign a form to unlock the accounts, he will show up. He is too greedy to stay away. He will bring Elliot, Graham said. Good, I said. I want him there. I want all of them there. For the next 3 hours, I did not sleep. I turned my hotel room into a war room. I knew exactly how my family would react when cornered. They would not admit fault. They would attack my credibility. They would say I was unstable. They would say I was bitter about being the lesser child. They would say I was being manipulated by predatory foreign bankers, and that I did not understand the complexities of high-level business. I needed to be bulletproof. I opened my laptop and began to dig through my personal digital archives. I was an analyst. Data was my sword. I found the emails from 7 years ago, when I was 22. My father had sent me a message saying he could not help with my final semester of tuition because liquidity was tight. I cross-referenced that date with the bank records Lucas had given me. On that exact day, Daniel had wired $15,000 to a travel agency for a luxury cruise to the Mediterranean for him and Lydia. I printed both documents. I found the text messages from Lydia when I was 25, asking me to pay the overdue electric bill for the Lakeview house because there was a mix-up with the bank. I had paid it. $600 out of my entry-level salary. 2 days later, she had posted a photo of a new designer handbag on Instagram. I printed the receipt and the photo. I found the loan documents for my car, the lease agreement for my apartment, the records of every single dollar I had earned, saved, and spent. I built a dossier of my own independence. Every page was a testament to the fact that I owed them nothing. Every page was proof that Agnes was right. I was the one who had been abandoned, and yet I was the one who was standing tall. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Elliot. I picked it up. It was a long block of text, rambling and desperate. Emily, this has gone too far. Mom is crying. Dad is talking about lawyers. But he is scared. You need to stop this. We are family. You cannot just cut us off like this. Think about the baby. Think about what you are doing to our reputation. You are destroying everything we built. I read it twice. I analyzed the syntax. We are family. Think about the baby. You are destroying. I looked for the questions that were missing. He did not ask, why did you leave? He did not ask, did we hurt you? He did not ask, is it true that we tried to steal your inheritance? He did not care about the morality of the situation. He only cared that the tap had been turned off. To him, I was not a sister. I was a broken ATM. I felt a final flicker of guilt die in my chest. It was a relief. I realized that the brother I thought I had, the one who had once shared a cookie with me when we were kids, was gone. He had been consumed by the same rot that had taken our parents. I typed a reply. I did not defend myself. I did not explain about the Swiss bank or the key or Agnes's letter. I did not offer comfort. There is a meeting at Stevens Meridian on Thursday at noon. I wrote, be there. I pressed send. Then I closed my laptop. The plan was crystallized. I was not going to scream at them. I was not going to throw wine in their faces. I was not going to key their cars. Those were the actions of someone who felt powerless. I was going to walk into that room and close the door. I was going to sit at the head of the table, and I was going to let the structure that Agnes had built do the talking for me. The system was the revenge. The bylaws were the weapon. The silence was the punishment. I packed my bag. I placed the dossier carefully on top of my clothes. I checked the flight time. I was going home, but for the first time, I was not going back to the house where I was a ghost. I was going back to the company where I was the boss. The next morning, as my taxi took me to Zurich Airport, I watched the city slide by. It was efficient. It was clean. It was fair. I thought about the Agnes Stevens Resilience Fund. I thought about the first check I would write from it. It would not be for me. It would be for a girl I had met in college, a brilliant artist whose parents had cut her off because she refused to study law. She was waiting tables now. I smiled. My parents tried to steal a legacy to buy more marble floors and sports cars. I was going to take that legacy and use it to buy freedom for people they would never even look at. Agnes would have liked that. I walked through the terminal, my heels clicking on the polished floor. I passed a newsstand. The headline on a business paper read, Market Stability Predicted for Coming Quarter. You have no idea, I whispered to myself. I boarded the plane. I declined the champagne the flight attendant offered. I ordered black coffee. I needed to be sharp. The flight back to the United States was 12 hours. I spent every minute of it reviewing the script Graham and I had prepared. Daniel will bluster. Let him. Lydia will cry. Ignore it. Elliot will beg. Deny him. I visualized the conference room, the long mahogany table, the view of the city. It was the room where my father liked to play God. He liked to sit there and move people around like chess pieces. He did not know that the board had been flipped. He did not know that the king was actually a pawn, and the pawn he had ignored for 20 years had just been promoted to queen. When the plane wheels touched down in Portland, it was raining. Of course it was raining, but the gray sky did not make me feel sad. It felt like cover. I took a deep breath of the damp air as I stepped out of the terminal. "Thursday at noon," I said to the rain. "Do not be late." The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Stevens Meridian Tower was designed to intimidate. It was a glass box suspended in the sky, offering a panoramic view of Portland that usually made people feel like they owned the city. Today, however, the gray clouds pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows made the room feel like an aquarium. It was exactly 12 o'clock. The long mahogany table was already crowded. The 6 independent members of the board of directors were seated, murmuring among themselves. They were nervous. Board members hate surprises, and an emergency compliance review, called by an external legal counsel, is the kind of surprise that makes people check their personal liability insurance. I stood by the window, my back to the door, watching the rain streak the glass. Graham Voss sat at the side of the room, silent and still as a statue, his hands folded over a closed laptop. The heavy double doors swung open. My family walked in. They entered in a formation that I recognized immediately. The phalanx. Daniel led the way, chest puffed out, wearing his power suit, navy blue, pinstriped, with a tie that cost more than a mid-range television. Lydia was half a step behind him, dressed in a sharp white blazer that was clearly chosen to suggest innocence and purity. Trailing them were Elliot and Sienna. They looked less confident. Elliot was clutching a leather portfolio so tightly his knuckles were white. He had dark circles under his eyes, the telltale sign of a man who had spent 3 nights trying to figure out why his credit cards were still declining. Sienna walked with her head down, avoiding eye contact with the board members she usually tried to charm. They moved toward the head of the table. Daniel headed straight for the chairman's seat, the leather throne at the far end, facing the screen. "Good afternoon, everyone," Daniel boomed, projecting a confidence that was entirely hollow. "Sorry for the dramatic summons. Just a few technical glitches to iron out with the legal team, and then we can get back to business." He reached for the back of the chair. "Actually," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through his bluster like a razor wire. I turned away from the window and stepped into the light. "That seat is taken," I said. Daniel froze. He looked at me, blinking. "Emily, what are you doing here? This is a board meeting. Family matters are for the weekend." "I agree," I said, walking slowly toward the table. "This is not a family matter. This is a shareholder matter." I walked past him. I did not shove him. I did not touch him. I simply moved into the space he was trying to occupy with such absolute certainty that he instinctively stepped back. I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down. A ripple of shock went through the room. The board members exchanged glances. Lydia let out a sharp, indignant gasp. "Emily, get up," Daniel hissed, leaning over the table, his face flushing red. "You are embarrassing yourself. You have no standing here. You are not on the board. You are not even an employee." "Graham," I said, ignoring my father completely. "Connect the call." Graham hit a key on his laptop. The massive screen on the wall behind me flickered to life. The room dimmed slightly as the image resolved. It was a live feed from Zurich. The background was the austere, stone-walled conference room of Alpenstein Private Bank. Lucas Brenner sat in the center of the frame, looking like a high-definition portrait of European authority. "Good evening from Zurich," Lucas said. His voice was amplified by the room's surround sound system, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I am Lucas Brenner. Senior Director of Fiduciary Services at Alpenstein Private Bank. "Who is this?" Daniel demanded, looking at the screen. "We do not use Swiss banks. We bank with Chase. I am the authorized representative of Edelweiss Holdings AG." Lucas continued, his tone bored. "Edelweiss is the majority shareholder of Stevens Meridian Systems, holding a controlling interest of 62% of all voting stock." The room went dead silent. The board members stopped shuffling their papers. 62%. That was not just a stake. That was absolute dominion. "I have never heard of Edelweiss," Daniel spat. "This is a fraud. I control the voting proxy for the family trust." "You did," Lucas corrected. Past tense. Lucas typed something on his end. The screen split. On the left was Lucas. On the right, a complex organizational chart appeared. It showed the flow of power, starting from Agnes Stevens, moving through the Swiss entity, and landing on the American company. "Your mother, Agnes Stevens, established this structure 20 years ago," Lucas explained. "She retained beneficial ownership through the Swiss holding company to ensure the family legacy was protected from impulsive management." "That is a lie," Lydia shouted. Stepping forward, her composure was cracking. "Agnes trusted Daniel implicitly. She would never hide things from him." "On the contrary," Lucas said. "She hid everything from you because she anticipated this exact week." The chart on the screen changed. The line connecting Daniel to the voting rights turned bright red and severed. A new green line extended from the top box, bypassing Daniel entirely and landing on a new box at the bottom. The name in the box was Emily Stevens. "Pursuant to the bad actor covenants embedded in the trust deed," Lucas recited, "any attempt by a trustee to disenfranchise a lawful beneficiary triggers an immediate revocation of authority, the control of Edelweiss Holdings, and by extension Stevens Meridian Systems, has been transferred to the standby controller." Lucas looked directly into the camera. "That controller is Ms. Emily Stevens. I am acting under her direction." Daniel stared at the screen. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at the board members. They were not looking at him. They were looking at the screen, reading the fine print. "This is ridiculous," Elliot stammered, his voice cracking. "You cannot just steal the company because of some secret paper. We did nothing wrong. We were just restructuring the estate." "Restructuring," I repeated. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table. "Is that what you call it?" I nodded at the screen. "Lucas, show them the logs." The screen changed again. This time, it displayed a forensic digital report. It was a list of failed transactions, stamped with the unmistakable red headers of a banking security alert. "Exhibit A," Lucas narrated. "Thursday, 14:30 hours. Attempted wire transfer of $2.5 million from the core capital account. Initiated from IP address 192.168.1.5. A floor plan of the Lakeview Heights house appeared, pinpointing the location of the signal. "That IP traces to the master study," Lucas said. "Daniel's computer." Daniel paled. "Exhibit B," Lucas continued. "Thursday, 15:15 hours. Attempted liquidation of the bond portfolio. Initiated from IP address 192.168.1.12. The locator dot moved to the guest house. "That traces to a MacBook Pro registered to Elliot Stevens," Lucas said. All eyes turned to Elliot. He shrank back, clutching his notes like a shield. "And finally," Lucas said, his voice dropping to a chilly monotone, "the authorization codes used to attempt these transfers were flagged as hostile. The bank received a signed directive from Daniel and Lydia Stevens stating that Emily Stevens was to be removed from the beneficiary list due to estrangement. This declaration was false, and it was the trigger that locked you out." Lucas paused. "You did not just try to steal from your daughter. Mr. Stevens, you tried to rob the majority shareholder in the eyes of Swiss law. That is not a family dispute. That is corporate malfeasance." The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. It was the sound of a reality shattering. I watched the board members. These were people who had played golf with my father for decades. They had eaten at his table. They had laughed at his jokes. But in business, friendship has a very low melting point. The board member to my right, a man named Robert who ran a logistics empire, slowly pushed his chair back. The screech of the chair legs against the floor was loud. He stood up, picked up his notepad, and walked around the table. He did not walk toward Daniel. He walked toward me. "Ms. Stevens," Robert said, his voice neutral. "I was unaware of these irregularities. If Edelweiss is indeed the majority holder, we need to discuss the governance transition immediately." He sat down 2 seats away from me. Then the next member moved, then the third. It was a slow migration, a physical realignment of loyalty. Within 2 minutes, the chairs around Daniel were empty. He was standing alone at the foot of the table, isolated, stripped of the illusion that he was in charge. Lydia looked around, her eyes wide with panic. She realized that the social capital she had spent years hoarding was worthless in this room. No one cared about her parties. No one cared about her blazer. They looked at her as a liability. "Daniel," Lydia whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "Do something." But Daniel had nothing left to do. He was staring at the screen, at the signature of his mother on the trust deed. He was finally seeing the wall he had run into. "You planned this," Daniel whispered, looking at me with a mixture of hatred and awe. "You sat at dinner and said nothing. You let us walk into this." "I did not plan your greed, Dad," I said calmly. "I just prepared for it." Sienna, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly spoke up. She shifted the baby in her arms, the baby that had been quiet, as if sensing the tension. She looked at Elliot, who was trembling, and then she looked at Daniel, who was defeated. Then she looked at me. Her eyes were calculating. She saw the board members deferring to me. She saw the Swiss banker awaiting my command. She realized that the security she had married into was a mirage, and the real power was sitting in the chair she had ignored. "Emily," Sienna said, her voice shaking slightly, if the accounts are frozen and the voting rights are yours, what does this mean for us? For the house? For Elliot's salary?" She asked the question everyone was thinking but was too polite to say. I looked at her. I looked at the perfectly manicured nails that had picked at the blanket during dinner. I looked at the fear in her eyes. It was real fear. The fear of a world without a safety net. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply picked up a pen from the table, a silver Mont Blanc that my father had left there at the last meeting, and clicked it open. "It means," I said, my voice filling the room, "that we are going to renegotiate the terms of your existence, and this time, I am the one holding the pen." I reached into my bag and pulled out 2 thick manila folders. I placed them on the mahogany table with a deliberate weight. They landed with a heavy final sound that echoed in the silent room. Thud, thud. It was a perfect inversion of the dinner at Lakeview Heights. 3 nights ago, they had set the table, poured the wine, and served me a beautifully plated betrayal. They had told me what was going to happen. Now, the table was mine, and I was the one serving the menu. "You have 2 options," I said, my voice steady. "And unlike the options you gave me, mine are actually legal." I tapped the first folder. "Option 1, I began, looking at Graham. "We proceed with a full adversarial response. Graham files a formal complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding the attempted misappropriation of corporate assets. Lucas files a report with the Swiss banking ombudsman detailing the attempted fraud against the Edelweiss Trust." I looked at Daniel. "This option involves an immediate criminal referral. It involves a forensic audit of your personal finances to recover the funds you tried to wire. It involves your immediate removal from the board for cause, which means you forfeit your severance package and your unvested stock options. We will also seek a court order to seize the Lakeview Heights property to satisfy the debts owed to the holding company." Daniel flinched as if I had slapped him. Lydia let out a small, strangled noise. "That is the nuclear option," I said calmly. It will take years. It will cost millions in legal fees. And when it is over, you will have nothing. No house, no reputation, no money. I tapped the second folder. Option 2, I said. We call this the controlled exit. I opened the folder and slid a document toward Daniel. You resign as CEO, effective immediately. You cite health reasons. It saves face. The board accepts it with regret. I slid a second document toward Elliot and Sienna. You sign a waiver, a permanent, irrevocable release of all claims against the estate of Agnes Stevens. You acknowledge that you have no rights to the Edelweiss Trust or Stevens Meridian Systems. Elliot looked at the paper, his hands shaking. But how will we live? We have the mortgage. We have the baby. Read paragraph 4, I said coldly. He looked down. I am establishing a dedicated trust for your son. I explained. It is a closed trust. It covers education, medical expenses, and basic housing needs until he is 25. The money goes directly to the vendors. Not a single cent goes to you. You do not touch the principal. You do not control the disbursements. You are the parents. But I am the banker. I looked at Sienna. Your son will be safe. He will go to good schools. He will have health insurance, but he will not be a prop for your lifestyle anymore. Sienna looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't anger, it was relief. She realized that I was offering the one thing Elliot never could, actual stability. And finally, I said, sliding the last document toward Lydia, the non-disparagement agreement. You do not speak to the press. You do not spin this story. If I hear a single whisper that I stole the company or that I am unstable, the trust for the baby is paused pending an investigation, and I will sue you for breach of contract. I sat back in the leather chair. Those are the terms. They are non-negotiable. You have 5 minutes. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The rain hammered against the glass windows, a relentless drumbeat to their hesitation. Lydia was the first to speak. She looked at me, her face crumbling, the mask of the perfect stepmother, the socialite, the matriarch. It all dissolved, leaving behind a frightened, aging woman. Emily, she pleaded, her voice trembling. Please, we are your parents, despite everything. We are a family. You cannot just treat us like employees. We raised you. I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had ignored my broken backpack, the woman who had forgotten my birthdays, the woman who had tried to erase my name from the family tree just 72 hours ago. No, I said. My voice was not loud, but it was absolute. You are not my parents, I told her. You are the people who tried to delete me. You gambled on my passivity. You bet that I was too weak to fight back. And now that you have lost that bet, you want to claim a relationship you never nurtured. I pointed to the screen where Lucas was watching, his face impassive. You are not facing a daughter right now. Lydia, you are facing a system. You triggered a protocol that you never bothered to understand, and it caught you. This is not emotional. This is structural. I looked at the clock on the wall. 3 minutes. Elliot was the first to break. He looked at Daniel, waiting for his father to fix it, to pull out some miracle or shout his way out of the trap. But Daniel was staring at the table, defeated. Elliot realized he was alone. He looked at the document in front of him. He looked at Sienna, who gave him a tiny, desperate nod. I will sign, Elliot whispered. It wasn't courage, it was fear. He picked up the pen I had left on the table. His hand shook so badly that the signature was barely legible, but it was there. He pushed the paper toward me, looking like a man who had just escaped a burning building only to realize he had left everything behind. Sienna signed next. She did it quickly, with the efficiency of someone who wanted to stop the bleeding. She looked at me as she capped the pen. Thank you, she whispered, for the baby. I did not thank her back. I just nodded. Daniel was staring at the resignation letter. The paper represented the end of his identity. Without the title of CEO, without the company, he was just a man with a lot of debt and a bad relationship with his children. I built this company, he muttered. Agnes built this company, I corrected him. You just spent the profits. He hesitated. He looked at the door, perhaps thinking about walking out. On the screen, Lucas cleared his throat. The sound was amplified, echoing through the room. Mr. Stevens, Lucas said, his voice crisp. My compliance team in Zurich is standing by to file the fraud report with the authorities. I have the send button ready. If that signature is not on the page in 60 seconds, I am instructed to proceed with option 1. Daniel closed his eyes. He let out a long, shuddering breath. He picked up the pen. He signed. It was a heavy, angry scrawl, tearing through the paper slightly. He pushed the folder away from him as if it were contaminated. Lydia was the last. She looked at the NDA. She knew that signing it meant she could never play the victim. She could never tell her friends that her ungrateful stepdaughter had ruined them. She had to swallow her poison in silence. She looked at me with pure venom. I hope you are happy, she hissed. Happiness is irrelevant, I replied. I am secure. She signed. Her signature was small, cramped, a tiny scratch of resentment at the bottom of the page. Graham Voss stood up. He walked around the table, collecting the documents with the reverence of a priest collecting offerings. He checked each signature. He verified the dates. He looked at the board members. The papers are in order, Graham announced. The transition is legal and binding. Robert, the board member who had moved first, nodded. Let the minutes reflect that the board accepts the resignation of Daniel Stevens and recognizes the appointment of Emily Stevens as the chairwoman of the board, representing the majority interest. There was no applause. There were no handshakes. There was just the sound of a reality shifting into a new gear. You may go, I said to my family. They stood up. They looked smaller than they had when they walked in. They did not look at each other. They walked out of the glass box, out of the company, and out of my life. I stayed in the chair. The board members filed out silently, leaving me alone with Graham and the giant screen. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the steel key. I placed it on the mahogany table. Next to it, I placed the draft charter for the Agnes Stevens Resilience Fund. Lucas was still on the screen. He was smiling now, a genuine, rare expression. Agnes would be pleased, Lucas said. We have a lot of work to do, I said. I want the Resilience Fund operational by the end of the quarter. We need to start vetting applicants. I want to find the kids who are exactly where I was 10 years ago. There is one final detail, Lucas said. A codicil that Agnes added to the trust. I did not mention it before because it only activates upon the successful execution of a hostile takeover defense. What is it? I asked. Agnes knew that greed is a renewable resource, Lucas said. She included a funding mechanism. The trust deed states that whenever a Level 3 event is triggered, meaning whenever a family member tries to steal from the estate, a penalty clause is activated. He tapped his keyboard. Alpenstein is now authorized to automatically deduct a fixed percentage of the remaining family dividend, the small amount left for your father's living allowance, and transfer it directly to the Resilience Fund, annually, in perpetuity. I stared at the screen. A laugh bubbled up in my chest. It was a genuine laugh, bright and clean. You mean, I started. I mean, Lucas finished, that their attempt to rob you has permanently increased the budget for helping others. Every dollar they tried to take will now generate 10 cents for a stranger who needs it. Their greed is now the engine of your charity. That is beautiful, I whispered. That, Lucas said, is Swiss engineering. I picked up the key. It felt warm in my hand now. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, and a shaft of pale sunlight was hitting the river below. I was 29 years old. I had no parents, no brother, and no childhood home to go back to. But I had a company, I had a mission, and I had the one thing they had tried so hard to take from me. I had a name that meant something. I turned back to the empty room. Close the file. Lucas, I said. Closing, he replied. Protocol complete. The screen went black. I walked out of the conference room, my heels clicking on the floor. I walked past the reception desk where the logo of Stevens Meridian Systems hung on the wall. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The system was running, the vault was locked, and the girl who used to fix everyone else's messes was finally building something of her own. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to hear where you are tuning in from. Please comment below with your city or country so we can see how far Emily's story has traveled. If you enjoyed seeing justice served, please subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach even more people. Your support means the world to us.